Drives me crazy. As a matter of fact, I am the king of options. I'm the guy in the car that you see over here on Barrett Parkway that's swerving left and right because I'm asking everybody, what do you want to eat? What would you like to eat? And about the time that we settle on something, I say, but hey, what about this place? And so our car is always swerving as we're trying to examine all of our options. I love options. I love the appetite menu because there's a lot of options that are there. And there's just something about options, isn't there, that's very freeing, that you know, well, I can go this direction or I can go that direction. I can choose to do some different things, in my life. But what about when the options run out? What about when options are not a choice and you find yourself locked into a situation and you're trying to figure out how you're going to navigate that situation? Well, boy, those times can be really, really tough. And so in the story Red Sea Rules, the basic idea behind it is that God sent Moses into Egypt and said, I want you to go there and I want you to bring my people out of bondage. So somewhere between 400 to 700 years, the nation of Israel had been in bondage there in Egypt. They were the ones doing the work of slaves, and now God was ready to be able to get his people into the promised land. And of course, the metaphor for us is, how do we get out of bondage to the things that we might be in bondage to? Maybe you're in bondage to a job that you really don't like. Maybe you're in bondage in a situation financially that you can't seem to get your way out of. I mean, there's a lot of different things that we can find ourselves in bondage, and we need a deliverer. So God said, I'm going to send Moses to be your deliverer. And so Moses goes down, and he negotiates with Pharaoh. Pharaoh refuses to let the people of God go. And then through a series of plagues that were sent into the nation of Egypt, eventually Pharaoh relents and says, okay, I'm going to let the people go. Now, depending on who you talk to, there's probably somewhere between 2 and 3 million people that we're talking about that left Egypt to head toward the promised land. And after the people have left, and they've taken their unleavened bread and they've gotten themselves on the road, after traveling for some time, they find themselves in front of the Red Sea, and they've got mountain ranges on each side of them. The Red Sea is lying in front of them, and then of all things, Pharaoh decides that he wants those people back. And so he sends his armies after them, and they could see the dust rising behind them. So I want you to get a kind of a more simplistic picture of where they are. They're trapped. They have no options. They can't go forward because there's a sea that's in front of them. They can't go backward because Pharaoh's army is coming after them. And they can't go to either side. It's that whole picture of being boxed in. I get claustrophobic when I feel like I am boxed in. I mean, it gets to my brain. I don't know if you're that way. Our family went to Disney last week, and I decided to get on one of the rides with a future grandchild of mine. And when we got on the Dumbo ride, and I don't need any of your comments about me riding the Dumbo ride, man, I felt so claustrophobic in that little old thing, packed in there. And I had to be brave because there was a 2-year-old, right, to be able to get out of it. I don't like being in claustrophobic situations. Whether I'm physically in a claustrophobic situation or whether I'm emotionally in a claustrophobic situation, when I'm just at that point where I'm going, there does not seem to be any kind of option. So, what do you do when there's no options that are open to you that you would choose? What do you do in that moment? So, Red Sea rule number 1 was for us to understand that where we've gotten to is absolutely in the providence of God. Wherever we've gotten to. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're going, steaming toward month number 8 that we've been in this pandemic. When is it going to be over? No one knows. No one has any idea about when it's going to be over. So we find ourselves in some ways trapped in the middle of that situation. That's our Red Sea. I read the other day that 50% of Americans with mortgages say they don't know how they're going to be able to pay their mortgage at the end of next month. 50% of Americans. Our economy is collapsing all around us. People in the restaurant industry, people in tourism, the airlines. When we flew, we virtually had a plane to ourselves and just a few others. I mean, everything has changed, and it's changed drastically. And here we are in front of a Red Sea of a pandemic, not knowing when there's going to be a solution. And you got Pharaoh's army behind us. We got to pay our bills. We've got to take care of our family. Our health care with everything else. And listen, folks, it can change in a heartbeat. A lot of you in our congregation and listening audience know my buddy Mike Lynch. I've known Mike since he was 10 years old. And Mike's one of the finest people on the planet, has an amazing wife named Ann. And this past week, they went through a tragedy in their family. On Friday morning, his father-in-law passed away from COVID. And 2 weeks ago, his father-in-law was fine. And then a week ago, he contracted COVID. And within a week, he went from being okay to passing from this earth. And so you want to pray for Mike. You want to pray for their family. But how many more of you that I'm looking at right now through a lens, you're going through the same thing? And you can't grieve the way that you normally grieve. You can't do things the way that you would normally do it, to be able to honor those that you love at their passing. And so there's not the closure that we would normally have in situations. And we've been watching so much of this here in our church family. I was talking with one of our members as she was riding with her mom to the cemetery because her dad had passed away during this time. And your heart just goes out to people because we're not able to grieve the way we'd normally be able to grieve. And so you find yourself sitting here and you find yourself at this Red Sea moment. Now, it's one thing to find yourself at the Red Sea, experience that you're going through, because there's nothing that you've done that's caused you to be in this situation. But last week I posed it briefly during my message, and I said I would revisit it. What about when you're facing the Red Sea, and you got Pharaoh's army coming behind you, and you got the mountains surrounding you, and you're the one that put yourself into that situation by making poor choices, by doing things that you knew. Look, we all battle. I battle every day. I battled yesterday with the side of me that Jesus came and died for. He didn't die for the good side of me. He died for that side of me that's the anger and discouragement and all the things that we all go through, in our emotional life as we struggle to be the people that God has called us to be. And we're always fighting that battle, and we will until the day that we go home to be with Jesus. There'll be certain things that we're battling in our life. And maybe that's our Red Sea. And maybe we've made some really bad choices. And now we find ourselves at a time in our life where, because of our choices, the consequences have occurred. You get to choose, you get to make your choices, but the consequences are built in. And one of my favorite quotes is Robert Louis Stevenson. He said, sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. We do. Well, what if you're at your Red Sea because you've made bad choices? Does God then look at your situation differently than someone through no fault of their own? They find themselves in that position. And the answer might be surprising to you, because I don't think that God looks at those differently. I think what God looks at is our heart. Are we ready to have things made right? Are we ready to step up and become the people that God created us to be, rather than living at a level that's so beneath what God would really want to be able to do for us, and the way that He would really want us to be able to live? So this week, I'm at a conference, and my good buddy John Maxwell was kind enough to say, hey, I want you to come. I want you to be my guest. And he does the Live to Lead seminar. It's out at 12 Stone Church, amazing church. And John is the most incredible speaker on the planet for me and my taste. He is just absolutely the best. He's inspirational. He's informative, motivational, just everything that I love in a speaker. John Maxwell's that guy. We've been friends for nearly 40 years of our life. Zig Ziglar introduced us all those years ago. And so he invited me out, and 12 Stone would normally, at the Live to Lead seminar, it would be packed out, but not this year, not with the pandemic. And so all of the guests that would have normally been on stage during the event were all being brought in virtually. And one of his guests that he had was Steve Harvey. Now, I don't know about you, but I love Steve Harvey. I just look at Steve Harvey and start laughing. He's like Jeff Foxworthy for me. I look at them and I start laughing before they even tell a joke. They just have that gift of laughter. And so he was on with John, and he started talking about some of the backstory of his life. And I've already gotten texts this morning from people who watched the first service and emails who said, what you shared about that was so impactful to my life. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that and eliminate some of the other stuff that I was going to talk about in my message. Here's what they were talking about. They were talking about success and how each step is necessary in order for you to have success. They said success is a series of steps. It's not like there's one big leap. And he said that what happens at each step that you take, that there's a compounding effect of what you've learned before. See, this year I'm going to have one of those major milestone birthdays, and I try not even to say the numerals because I'm realizing that my candles are going to cost more than my cake this year. And that starts messing with you right there. But I'm going to have one of those major milestones. But here's what I know. I have a lot of years of knowing how to do things the right way. And I've had times in those years when I've done things the wrong way. And so God has stored up for me wisdom because of the years that I've lived. There's not another leader that I want you to have during this time other than me getting to lead you during this time. Because I know what it's like to lose. I know what it's like to struggle. I could, if I sat here and told you every failure that I had in my life, you'd go, we need another pastor. I mean, this dude has been unbroken, in things that have happened. I was on Mike Lynch's podcast recently, Lynch with a Leader. You ought to subscribe to it. Does an amazing job. And he was talking to me, and Mike is so respectful. And he was talking about all these things that I've done and I've been a part of, and it was so nice. And then I looked at him, and we were taping it live, and I said, yeah, but what about my failures? And he started stuttering a little bit. And I said, no, it's the failures are where you learn your greatest lessons. It's when something didn't work out the way that you just knew that it was going to work out. How do you respond to those times? How do you respond when you were absolutely dead set sure this is God's will and then it didn't work out? How do you respond to those times? So John said each step compounds your previous steps that you've taken. And he said, you do not step your way to success. Each step is success. And how you face problems and how you face situations that are unchangeable. See, some of you have children with special needs. And it is a great deal of work when you're dealing with everything that you have to deal with. And God has brought you into that unique privilege of responsibility, of taking care of someone that has, and in this lifetime, you know that it will not change their situation. You say, well, God could do a miracle. I absolutely agree, God could do a miracle. But sometimes God chooses not to do a miracle. How do you do with the times when God says no? See, that's what the nation of Israel was facing. So here's what John and Steve Harvey. See, I never knew that Steve Harvey had been homeless at a point in his life. He's now called the busiest entertainer in the world. And there's John Maxwell, the greatest leadership guru in the world. And both of those men are talking about failure. And here's what they said that is so powerful. You should write this down, and then you should go back and think it through step by step. They said failure and success should never be separated. Failure and success should never be separated, because you learn things out of failure that you would have never, ever, ever found in success. And one of the things you find out the most is who you are. You want to talk about creating self-awareness? Find yourself with the Red Sea in front of you, the mountains behind you, and Pharaoh's army closing in. And you'll find out a lot about who you are. And they said, a time like this is how I'm taking it. I'm sitting there taking notes, thinking about you today. Thinking about how can I share this? And John said, a crisis is a detour. And a crisis takes us out of our routine and out of what we know. And then here was my aha moment. I spoke for Keller Williams and Kristen Crisp, who's a member here at our church, along with her mom, Judy, and I spoke for her on Thursday. And after I finished speaking, she polled the audience and said, what was your aha moment when I was speaking today? I taught them on goal setting. Well, here was my aha moment. He said, John said, you have to learn to embrace the detour. You got to hug the mess and lean into it. Or as Robin Roberts says, make your mess your message. Make the mess that you're going through your message. So here were all of those people, and they're sitting there and they're facing the Red Sea. And what in the world are they going to do? Well, Robert Morgan said this. He said, God gains glory when his enemies are defeated, when his children are delivered. God wants you to be delivered when his name is exalted, and when his exploits are remembered and his praises are sounded. That's the time when God is getting honor and God is getting glory. And he quotes a gentleman named C.H. Mackintosh in his book. And C.H. Mackintosh said, if we could only look upon a difficult crisis as an occasion of bringing out on our behalf the sufficiency of divine grace. See, God says, my grace is sufficient for you. And he's not going to give you that grace ahead of time. He's going to give you that grace right when you need it. And he said, so if we could look at our crisis and go, wow, this is an occasion for God to bring out the sufficiency of his divine grace, then it would enable us, he said, to preserve the balance of our soul. In other words, to have spiritual equilibrium to the point that we glorify God even in the deepest waters. Wow. That we glorify God even in the deepest waters. The next time you're overwhelmed, Robert Morgan says and challenges us, instead of saying, how can I get out of this mess? Try asking instead, how can God be glorified in this situation? See, I remember the day for me. And I've just finished a series called Treasures from the Dark, and I briefly mentioned it then, and I'll briefly mention it today. It was a Friday afternoon. I had just gone to the hospital to visit someone who had just had a baby. And the baby was beautiful and wonderful. And when I walked out of that hospital, I've never been so discouraged in my whole life. Because that's what I'd wanted to do. I wanted to walk out of a hospital and ends up my wife and my child die. And this was the first time I'd gone to the hospital to visit a couple who had had a baby after my experience. And I was what's my mother would call it, fit to be tied. Fit to be tied. I told the person I was with, I'm not getting back in the car. And the person I was with, my buddy Rodney Shell, he goes, what are you going to do? I said, I got to walk around. Got to walk around. I grew up in downtown Atlanta. That's home. I just got to go walk around. I told him where I'd meet him, over near Woodruff Park. And I walked from Crawford Long Hospital all the way up through there. It was a warm day. I got to Woodruff Park, and they were doing a concert, Friday afternoon concert. There were all these mamas and daddies and people driven in to meet their spouses getting off work. And I'm standing there, and I'm watching all this, and I'm thinking to myself, do y'all know what I've been through? And the answer was no, they don't. And I had this penetrating thought. And I know it was the Holy Spirit, because it's way beyond my thinking level. You can either get back in the race, or you can quit, and everybody will think it's very romantic that you just withered and died. Or you can handle this in a way that will honor God. And that's the first time the phrase, trouble handled rightly honors God, passed through my brain. People will tell you that's as much a part of who I am. Daniel Roberts told me this morning. That's a phrase, he said, it'll always be in my lexicon of thoughts. Trouble handled rightly honors God. That means you glorify God. So see, Red Sea rule, and as I stood there, I knew I just made a decision. Have you ever been at that point where you go, I just made a decision, and by golly, I'm going to stick to my decision? So Red Sea rule number 2 is, be more concerned for God's glory than your relief. Trouble handled rightly honors God. Success handled rightly certainly honors God to a degree. Buddy, I can tell you, they're looking at you when everything falls apart. They're wanting to know, are you going to be able to get through this? Is your faith going to sustain you? You know, it's that question that Simon Peter, Jesus was standing there one day, and Jesus had started teaching a lot of hard truth. And so people started walking away from him. And so Jesus looks at the disciples one day, and he looks at them and goes, are y'all going to leave me as well? Isn't that sad? Are y'all going to leave me as well? Oh, Simon Peter, God bless him. He goes, Lord, where will we go? Who would we turn to? Can I tell you that in this life, there's some hard lessons that our faith will teach us. And then we make a decision. Am I going to walk away because I don't like what's going on? And if you do walk away from your faith, where are you going to go? Where? What else is going to do it for? I don't know of anything. I am absolutely committed to being the person that God has called me to be. Why were they in this trouble? Listen to what it says. This is Psalms 106. Would you guys pop that up there on the screen for me? Psalms 106. Both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedness. Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, this is a psalmist writing about why they got into trouble. Why they got into trouble. Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wondrous works, and they did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love. But they rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea. And yet the psalmist said, he saved them. Why? For his name's sake, that he might make known his mighty power. He rebuked the Red Sea, and the Red Sea became dry. And he led them through the deep as through a desert. Or he saved them from the hand of the foe, and he redeemed them from the power of the enemy. And those waters that they feared, look at what he says, and the waters covered his adversaries. Not one of them was left. They believed his words. And then a phrase that we all use today, they sang his praises. They sang his praises. The sad thing today is how many people have a skewed view of who God really is. Some people think, well, God should just be this instant God, and he could, and forgive me, he should take care of any problems that arise. You know, he's really there to help us feel better about ourselves, but God's not going to get really personally involved in our situation. In other words, we start thinking, well, God just wants us to be nice. He wants us to feel good about ourselves, and you can just rest assured that God's not going to really bother you. He's going to leave you alone. He's going to let you do your own thing, but if you really need him, if it really, really, really gets bad, it might get bad enough that we have to start praying. Sadly, that's the description of the way a lot of people live their Christian lives. And I'm talking about Christians right here. Well, Red Sea rule strikes right at the heart of that mentality. Be more concerned for God's glory than for your own relief. So just think about that. When you're in the middle of a situation, you're going to make sure that you find a way to honor and to glorify God. And by the way, you find it all the way through his word. But nowhere is it stronger than when Jesus in John chapter 12, he's facing the cross. He's in Jerusalem. And he said, now my soul is troubled. It's okay, a troubled faith is better than no faith at all. And what shall I say? This is Jesus. He says, do I say, hey, Father, I want you to save me from this hour? He goes, no. Because it was for this very purpose that I've come to this hour. And then he makes a request to God. He says, Father, glorify your name. That's a step you need to take. That's a step I need to take. When we face our impossible situations, we say, God, glorify your name. Then, the Bible says that there was a voice that came out of heaven. I have both glorified it and I will glorify it again. What an incredible statement. Jesus knows he's going to be crucified. They're going to drive the nails through his hands and his feet. He's going to the cross. He says, I'm going to glorify your name. He taught us that early on. You know, in what we often refer to as the Lord's Prayer. What's the first request that's made of us in the Lord's Prayer? Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. To hallow someone is to honor them, to realize their prominence and their position. So what is Jesus telling us in that prayer? Because a lot of us have prayed that prayer. He's saying, God, may you be glorified and honored as only you alone deserve. And that's all I'm asking of you first. That's what I want the most. I want your name to be hallowed. And why? So that God's name will be glorified. So now let me ask you the unspoken question that a lot of us go through. Is God narcissistic? Is God narcissistic and saying, I want my name glorified? Because you know the situation they were in, Red Sea rule number 1, God put them there. And he said, the reason I'm putting you there, the reason you're boxed in, is to be able to bring glory and honor to my name. And so you can look at that and go, is God just selfish? No. You have to think of God in a totally different way. We can't put God into our category. You know what I mean? You know, like my buddies Ashley and Alex are down here on the front. They own AA Wellness, and they're the ones who have helped me to transform a lot of things in my life physically. And they'll tell you, man, you got to get sleep. You got to get sleep. How many of you like to get at least 8 hours sleep? Can I see your hand? Yeah. Doesn't that feel good? Some of you go, but I'm not getting it. I understand. But if you get 8 hours sleep, well then, it would reason logically, I hope God gets 8 hours sleep each night. But you know what we know about God? His word says he does not sleep and he does not slumber. You know why he doesn't sleep and slumber? This may blow your mind, because it said when his beloved are asleep, he's working for them in the night. When they're asleep, he's working for us. I love that verse. I love that thought. So, you know, if that's true, then think about who's the most important person in the universe. That would be God. A.W. Tozer said, what you think about when you think about God is the most important thing about you. Wow. God's that most important person in the universe. Now, if we know it, then obviously God already knows it. But suppose that he decided he's not going to act like he, is the most important person in the universe. What would that mean? That means that God would be acting in a way that's inconsistent with who he is. And those kinds of situations don't exist because there is no shadow of turning in God. He's the same. Absolutely. Today, yesterday, today, and forever. God is absolutely the same. So if God didn't see himself as the most important person in the universe, then he would be operating contrary to what truth is. So you and I have to realize the world doesn't revolve around us. And sometimes we're not going to get all the answers. So the first Sunday when I came back into my pulpit at New Oak Baptist Church, when my wife and child had died, I preached a message. And the message was called Minoring on Questions, Majoring on the Answers. See, if I spent the rest of my life just being absorbed with questions, I would never move very far. But if I spent the rest of my life trying to know God better, then I was going to be able to be better. He's the most important person in the universe. My question to you today, do you know him? Do you know him? Do you know that if you died today, that you're going to go to heaven? Let me pray a prayer with you right now. I'm going to continue to look right into the camera. Man, if you're at home and you're by yourself, just pray this prayer out loud with me. It'll strengthen you. If you're saying, Ike, I want to know when I lay my head down on the pillow tonight that I'm going to heaven, just pray this prayer with me. Just say, I ask you, Lord Jesus, to come into my life. I ask you to forgive me of my sin. I confess that you are God. I confess that I am not perfect, but I believe that Jesus was perfect. The word is called immutable. He never changes. I believe that Jesus is perfect. And I believe that Jesus died for me to make me right with God. And that's how you become his beloved. Just say to him, thank you for saving my soul, Jesus. And then ask him this one last thing. Just say, God, help me not to be ashamed of you. And listen, you prayed that prayer as Daniel Roberts comes out. If you prayed that prayer, you know what you triggered today? Angels in heaven started rejoicing. Because it says when one person repents, that the angels of heaven sing. And I like that thought.